Later in Matthew's gospel, we reach the Great Commission, where Jesus tells them to go out into the world making disciples and baptizing them. Go into all the world and prepare the way so that peoples of nations can be in relationship with and experiencing God. The Great Commission is what we Christians from all over use as a foundational missional statement. To go and make disciples for Christ. But what's interesting here is that before Jesus commissions them to go into the world to make disciples, Jesus commissions them to go and move mountains. Before he encourages his followers to go out and bring people to Christ, he encourages them to first go and move mountains. Why? Perhaps he makes them aware that sometimes mountains would stand in the way of people coming to God. Perhaps he makes them aware that sometimes mountains will prevent people from being committed to the path which leads them to the glory of God. Perhaps as a way of reminding them about their own journey back to God as a chosen people, Jesus uses this language. See, when the people of Israel in the Old Testament found themselves in captivity and exile because of disobedience, God cries out to them through the voice of Isaiah. And he lets them know that they are forgiven. And he lets them know that they can come back to him. And after the Israelites were released from Babylon, the path they traveled to Jerusalem was blocked by a mountain.
Yes.
And God, using this mountain as a symbol of obstacles that lay in wait for the people of Israel, says to Isaiah, this mountain shall be uprooted. Why? So that the highway would be made smooth. The highway that led them from Babylon to Jerusalem, the place where the temple of God was. The highway that led them from the place of sin to the place where the Shekinah glory of the great I Am was waiting for them. The highway that led them from a place of pain and torment to the place of divine deliverance and provision. So God reminded Isaiah by this mountain that as the people were on their way back to God, they were not to let anything, any obstacles, any mountains stand in the way of coming back into God's presence. And in the same way, Jesus calls his disciples to prepare the highway, to make smooth the path in which God's people could come back to God's presence.
Yes.
He prepares them to bring all nations to him by first preparing them to face and deal with the many mountains. The many mountains of problems and situations that may stand in the way of people traveling from their Babylon to Jerusalem. The mountains that may stand in the way from people moving from their place of sin to their inherited rightful place of atonement, from their place of pain to their place of hope and comfort. Jesus helps them realize that before they can effectively help the nations of people realize the benefits of a reconciled relationship with God, they must first be able to effectively face and move the many mountains that may stand in their way. They must be uprooters of mountains for the nations so they can have a smooth path to God. Zion, before we can even consider bringing people to God, before we can even consider spreading the word that all nations will receive, before we can consider baptizing and making new disciples of Christ.
Yes.
Before we can consider getting excited about the possibilities of new people joining this ministry.
Mm-hmm.
Before we can consider sharing our Bibles with our community, we must consider what it takes to move mountains.
Yes, yes.
And Jesus shows us what it takes to move mountains as he encourages his disciples in this text. He makes it clear some essential details about being uprooters of mountains. And first, he helps us understand that mountains that God calls us to move are specific in nature and are the mountains that God leads us to. Jesus leads his disciples to the place where they are, which is literally and symbolically a mountain. They are in Bethany, which is part of a mountain range of Mount of Olives. But symbolically, this has become a mountain that hindered those who needed to experience God. This mountain has become an obstacle of profane rituals and oppressive traditions that has made it difficult for poor people to even enter into the gates of the temple to atone for their sins. That's why Jesus turns tables and throws out money changers. This mountain where Jesus leads them to has become an obstacle of self-centeredness and entitlement. That's why the authorities get angry and try to dampen the move of God when Jesus heals but the blind and the lame in the temple. And that's why they try to stop even the children from praising. And so Jesus brings them to this mountain and says, you will be able to move this. Notice he didn't say you will be able to move a mountain. He was specific. Jesus wanted them to move this mountain. This mountain of religious pride. This mountain of oppressive religious traditions and rituals. This mountain of self-centeredness and entitlement. Why? So that the path to God for the poor and the sick and the lame and the children would be smooth, y'all. In Zion, God has led us to this place where we are confronted with this mountain. And we must be able to identify this mountain. And we identify why it is that God has led us here and positioned us here in this particular place. We must identify why God has led Zion from being next to a jailhouse to now being situated in the middle of a funeral home in a cemetery.
Yes.
We must identify why God has moved us and led us and positioned us to be in the center of schools and daycares. We must identify, y'all, why God has led us and positioned us and planted us right there in the middle of a drug-infested community. Or this mountain is specific and is for us. But oftentimes we have the Christian tendency to go super spiritual.
All right. Go ahead.
When we think about the mountains that we have to move out of other people's ways.
Yes, go ahead.
They need to let Satan stop using them. Mountains of principalities. Mountains of generational curses.
Go on.
Let me help you understand that the mountains that God has led us to are this mountain is hunger. Because hunger may stop people from coming to God. Or this mountain, y'all, is homelessness. Or this mountain is illiteracy. Or this mountain is domestic abuse. Or this mountain is drug addiction. Or this mountain is prostitution. That is our this mountain. If you can't see why God has put us here. God leads us and have led us to this mountain. Next, the mountains that God leads us to move. God has also empowered us and equipped us to move. They are for us to move. If we were unable to do it, God would have put us somewhere else. He didn't put us in the suburbs, y'all.
All right.
We don't have beachfront property, y'all. God put us here because you are able to move the mountains that God put you at. Jesus said to the disciples, you will be able to move this mountain. Not you might be able to move it. He said you can, you will be able. He has given them the power. He has given them the ability. This mountain that can be moved, he has led them to. He said you can move this mountain. However, the disciples must be the ones to choose whether or not they want to be mountain movers.